Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Blowback. This is the first of 10 bonus episodes you'll be getting from us this season. And it is a great place to start because it's the first of two parts of an interview we did with Pakistani journalist Ahmed Rashid. Ahmed is a legend in the Pakistani press, not only for his definitive reporting on the Taliban. He published the first major book about them in 2000. But also for his reporting and writing on a slew of other subjects, from Central Asia, pipeline politics, to U.S. foreign policy, to militant Islam. And we made use of Ahmed's work quite a bit this season. And we spoke with Ahmed about a range of things, basically walking through the timeline of our season from the 1980s and the jihad against the Soviets, to the rise of the Taliban during the warlord years of the 90s, all the way through the American war in the 2000s. He was very generous with his time, and we thank him again here for giving us his time. So sit back in the first of two episodes we're doing in conversation with Ahmed Rashid. Ahmed Rashid, thank you so much for joining us. Let's start at the start, or something like the start. What was American policy like toward Afghanistan in the 20th century up until the late 70s, when the Marxist coup started to kick things up a notch?
Well, throughout the 1950s, when the Cold War really took off, both countries, the Soviet Union and the Americans, were helping Afghanistan with road building, with development projects. But very swiftly, the Russians took on the role of supporting and training a modern Afghan army. This is something the U.S. was not prepared to do because it was already doing the same thing next door in Pakistan. And Pakistan was a more reliable ally because it had a standing army which was considered to be very efficient. And the Pakistanis very much wanted the Americans to be in their country, helping them, etc. So there was this rivalry, really. The American role in Afghanistan was relegated to development projects, not to training military. And certainly, when I first went to Afghanistan, the Soviet military was quite obviously there in some force. And as a result of this, the officer training course, which officers went off to the Soviet Union, what really happened there was that a lot of them became communists. The Afghan officers became communists, and it was they who then launched this coup attempt. Afghanistan, remember, was a monarchy. It had been ruled by kings for the last 300-400 years, and the Soviets were training this young, new, educated officer class for the first time, and also making them into Soviet ideologues. So this was the setting when the coup took place in 1978. And it was really an attack on the monarchy, on the failure of the monarch, King Zahir Shah, who was a very mild-mannered man, but not particularly aggressive or looking forward to development and all the rest of it. He succumbed to this coup. There were troops who supported him. There was a brief clash over the presidential palace. But essentially, these officers took over, and almost immediately they came into conflict with the civilian communists. So there was a group of Sovietized army officers. There were civilian communists who were divided into two very distinct groups that had been at loggerheads, the Parcham and the Khalq. These were the two groups that emerged from the communists in Afghanistan, and they were at loggerheads with each other right from day one. And this is what eventually ruined their effort to Sovietize the Afghan system. So the political system suffered enormously because now we had the military wanting to assert themselves, and we had these two groups, Parcham and Khalq. Khalq were considered to be a more nationalist party, communist but nationalist, and Parcham was considered to be a die-hard Soviet clone, support for the Soviets. So essentially, what happened was that there was a falling out of these two, and there was literally a very brutal internal war that took place between Parcham and Khalq, in which a lot of Afghans lost their lives, and certainly the king's party was massacred, and they were killed off completely by both Parcham and Khalq. And initially, we had the Khalq were in a position, they took over all the reins of government. And Parcham became more dependent on the Soviet Union and spent a lot of time complaining to the Soviets, "You better do something, because these Khalqis are a threat, and they may go back to into the lap of Pakistan or one of the neighbors like Iran." So what we had then was a coup within a coup, in which the Parchamis came back in. This time they did it with the help of the Soviets. The Soviets promised them help. The Soviets were very worried by the situation in Iran, where this Islamic movement had just taken over. Khomeini had just arrived in Iran. They didn't know what to expect from Iran. They were worried that there was this growing Islamist movement across Soviet Central Asia and in southern Russia, their own area. And they wanted to thwart that, which they did, by invading Afghanistan. So the Soviets invaded in 1979, sent in about 120,000 troops, occupied the whole country. But what we have then was that didn't stop the internal civil war between Parcham and Khalq. Parcham was now in the ascendant, but Khalqis were fighting back. And at the same time, of course, we had the growth of the Mujahideen, the Afghan guerrilla movement that was funded by the Americans and anti-Soviet. So essentially, this early Afghan history was a bungled affair. The Americans lost out, the Soviets eventually lost out, and all the neighbors lost out. It was very badly bungled. There was no attempt at trying to heal the rift within Afghan society through other means, not through war.
You've written about the Afghan communists and their agenda. What would you, how would you characterize it when they came to power in the late 70s?
The Afghan communists were too ambitious in wanting to develop socialism in Afghanistan, and that led to the growth of an Afghan resistance movement, who were anti-Soviet, who were anti the secularism of the Soviets, and the Soviets, of course, did their best to undermine Islam and the religion, and Afghans were very fanatical about their belief in their religion. And so what we have was the growth of a resistance movement there was both nationalist parties and secular parties and religious parties. And the Pakistan, which now began slowly to play a major role because they were the main ally of the Americans, and they had got the Americans to give them massive quantities of aid for themselves and for Afghanistan. And billions of dollars started coming into Pakistan in order to fund the Afghan Mujahideen. Now, these Mujahideen were essentially local leaders. They were not the urban politicians who were now dominated by the communists. These were rural leaders who dominated the politics of the countryside and were essentially very pro-Islamic, but they had other elements in them. And Pakistan took this opportunity of supporting only one section of the resistance, and those were the Islamists. Pakistan had its own interest there because it wanted help from these very Islamists in Kashmir, which was occupied by the Pakistani Kashmir was occupied by India, and they wanted to get rid of the Indians from Kashmir and take over Kashmir. So it was in Pakistan's interest to support the Americans and to persuade the Americans not to arm the Afghan nationalists, but to arm the Afghan fundamentalists. And this is what happened. So we had this struggle reflected, first by Parcham and Khalq and the communists, and now within the Mujahideen, we had this struggle between those who were essentially Islamists in orientation and those who were not and believed in secularism, democracy, etc. So the money and the weapons that the U.S. started delivering in large quantities, and along with the help of the Saudis, even the Chinese, who were not on particularly good talking terms with the Americans, even the Chinese saw it as in their interest to help the Mujahideen. And these Mujahideen became a very potent force. And the Americans were giving them increasingly more sophisticated weapons, such as Stinger missiles, very similar to what is going on today in Ukraine, with American support going to the Ukrainians, an increase in sophisticated weapons. The Americans have just delivered F-16s, fighter jets to the Ukrainians. The Afghans didn't have much of an air force, but they had these anti-helicopter missiles, the Stingers, which proved to be very lethal. So essentially, the Afghan these Mujahideen commanders were either they were tribal figures, leaders from the tribes, because remember Afghanistan was a tribal society, or they were elders, who we call what the Afghans call elders, those leaders of their society, or they were modern and quite well educated. A very small minority was this well-educated minority from the cities, from the urban areas. So it was a mixture of people and leaders who developed. And because the flow of money and weaponry was largely going to the Islamists were in a majority as far as the resistance was concerned. And that's how the war between the Soviets and the Mujahideen developed over the next 10 years. There was terrible carnage. The Soviets killed over 1 million Afghans. Millions of Afghans fled into neighboring Pakistan and Iran and became refugees. This was the first major refugee crisis of the Cold War, in which 3 to 4 million refugees fled into neighboring states. And it was a war that, much as today in Ukraine, it was a war that the Americans were determined to win. And they were ultimately succeeded because of the degree of support they gave to the Mujahideen, the weaponry, the money, and also the divisions within the communists, which were to emerge by the end of the occupation.
In several sources we've relied on this season, there's a history somewhat untold in American accounts about the peace initiatives of the Soviet Union from quite early on, really from the first year onward, that picked up especially under Yuri Andropov. But he was making a beeline for the United Nations really in the first 3 years of the war. What do you think? Were these efforts stymied by the United States and its allies? And if so, was that essentially a strategy to prolong the war for as long as possible, despite the Soviets' desire to get out?
Well, I think you're absolutely right in your analysis. I mean, clearly, what happened was that there were some very hardline lobbies all across the world. I mean, the Muslim world, the Saudis, the Gulf Emirates, they supported a prolonged war against the Soviets. They wanted to see the end of this communist regime. Iran had its own reasons for wanting to prolong the war. Pakistan had its own reason. But most importantly, the Americans had. Republicans were in control. Ronald Reagan and successive American administrations were keen to have a victory. And they were getting a victory simply because the Soviets were losing. This was not a war that the Soviets could sustain. That as their weaponry improved, so did the deaths of the Soviet soldiers. And very early on, they developed a lobby in Moscow that we are losing the war, we should get out. If we don't get out now, we will be shamed into surrendering to the Americans. It's better we do a negotiated settlement. And so the Russians encouraged the United Nations to set up a team to negotiate between the Americans, the Russians, the Mujahideen, and the Afghan Communist government. There were 4 parties in this conflict. So these talks, which I was very deeply involved because I was, monitoring the UN very closely. These talks took place in Geneva, and they went on for 7 years. A very prolonged negotiation. Everybody wanted their 2 bits of action, and it took many years for final agreement. But the pressure really came when Gorbachev came into power. And Gorbachev became Secretary General of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, and he wanted to change, the ideology of the Soviet Union and introduce a more liberal agenda. And he knew he couldn't do it without resolving the Afghan conflict, because the whole world was opposed to the Soviet Union and their intervention in Afghanistan. And So what we had then was Gorbachev promoting a reconciliation and a peace, an end to the war, and the Soviets agreed to pull out. By 1979, they had come to an agreement through the United Nations to pull out, and all 4 parties. Now, what the key thing there was for the Americans was that, of course, they were extremely excited at the prospects of the Soviets pulling out, something that the Americans could paint as a victory against the Soviet Union, the defeat of the Soviets in the Cold War. So the Americans were seeing a total victory, and they didn't want to lose any of the propaganda effort that this would mean in other parts of the world. The Soviets obviously were trying to downplay their retreat, saying it was a retreat in good order. It was aimed at ending the war and the suffering of the Afghan people, etc. But it did work out. They did leave. But the critical point in all this was that what did they leave behind? The Soviets left behind a completely destroyed and depleted country, which had suffered enormous losses, and that only led to another war, the next stage of another war.
The Civil War in the early 1990s, after the Soviets left, you describe as perhaps the most destructive period in the country's history. How did these warlords, these former Mujahideen commanders, how did they rule the country? And what was so brutal about that period that made the Taliban's arrival seem, to some, preferable at that point?
Let me just say that many people feared the breakup of Afghanistan. And here we come into the complicated picture of the Afghan tribal and ethnic makeup. The Pashtuns, who occupied southern and eastern Afghanistan, the tribal Pashtuns were the ones who basically promoted fundamentalism. A lot of them were fundamentalists, and they got help from the Saudis, from the Islamic world, etc. And the opposition to them came from the non-Pashtuns, who were basically from the tribes of the Tajiks, the Hazaras, the Uzbeks. These were all ethnic groups, originally coming from Central Asia, but who had settled in Afghanistan. And they were the more balanced, more secular groups. And they had their own leaders. Their prominent leader was Ahmed Shah Massoud, who was a Tajik, General Rashid Dostum, who was initially a Soviet soldier and officer, and then switched sides and became the leader of the Uzbeks. And there were Hazara leaders. So it became very early on, once the Soviets left, it became an ethnic competition between the Pashtuns on one side and the Tajiks, Uzbeks, and these minority nationalities on the other side. And they began fighting each other for control of Kabul. And this was a devastating stage, basically because the Soviets had not bothered to leave behind. They didn't want to leave behind a government or any kind of semblance of government. And the Pakistanis were urging the Americans not to accept the Soviet withdrawal until the Soviets had formed a government in Kabul, which would be a coalition government and bring all the sides together. None of this actually happened. The Soviets withdrew. People were hoping that the Americans would stay back and help in rebuilding Afghanistan and helping the Afghans come together with the government. But that didn't happen either. The Americans, as soon as the Soviets left, the Americans left and said, this has nothing to do with us. This is the end of the Cold War. We won the Cold War and we should just get out. And much to the dismay of many Afghans, the Americans just left without leaving any kind of real legacy behind of rebuilding the country. So when the Soviet withdrawal was completed, there was a very brief but very deadly firefight in Kabul between Gulbuddin Hikmatyar, who was the radical leader of the Pashtuns, and the non-Pashtuns. And the non-Pashtuns won temporarily, but that unleashed this whole civil war between the Pashtuns and the non-Pashtuns. And this civil war was promoted by each side had various commanders from the Mujahideen period who now wanted to control Kabul. And so there was a very bloody, bitter 4-5-way struggle between the Pashtuns, the non-Pashtuns, tribes, etc., to control Afghanistan. And nothing positive emerged. It was the most destructive period. Kabul itself was almost destroyed by the internal fighting. And so this, from 1989 until 1992-93, this war continued. And it unleashed, of course, many extremist groups. You had, Al-Qaeda, you had other extremist groups developing under the umbrella of these warlords who had emerged. The warlords gave protection to extremist groups. The Saudis continued supporting the Pashtuns because they thought that these Pashtuns would knock out the Iranians. The Iranians were supporting the Shia Hazaras, who belonged to their sect of Islam, because they thought this would knock out the Saudis. And so there was this real dogged attempt to gain the maximum advantage. And essentially what happened was the public became fed up, and even the younger elements in the Mujahideen who were seeing this bloody civil war replaced the sacrifices that they had made to get rid of the Soviets. We had this, the young elements within the Mujahideen said, to hell with our elders, they've ruined the country, they've destroyed everything, they're not making peace, we will make peace. And that's how this Taliban group emerged amongst the Pashtuns in Kandahar. And they became instantly popular because they were talking about ending the war, disarming the population, and developing Afghanistan. And of course, so they became very popular, and they took over large chunks of territory, especially in the Pashtun areas in the south, and made two very bloody forays to try and conquer northern Afghanistan, where these minorities were based. But they were defeated very soundly. So the war continued with the Taliban Pashtuns in the south of the country, the non-Pashtuns in the north of the country, and fighting it out now. So this was a new level of the civil war. The civil war was just continuing under another name, which was Taliban and anti-Taliban and pro-Taliban. So what we had was a repeat performance of what we experienced in 1990, 91, 92. We had a repeat performance. The Taliban. It took 3 years, 4 years before the Taliban actually conquered Kabul in 1996, and only when they did that did they start conquering the country and becoming a national power.
Now, thanks to your reporting and the reporting of others from the time, something we cover on the show is the initial period of Taliban rule and the rather open stance the United States took to it. They made noises about the human rights violations, or segments of the American government did. But as you reported, I believe, one State Department official told a scrum of reporters, "We can live with them. It's going to be like a little Saudi Arabia." And indeed, there was pipeline politics at play here. So what was this initial period like, this arrival of the Taliban and the deal-making going on?
Well, the Americans had very little understanding of what was going on the ground. They had no embassy in Afghanistan. They had no experts. Their nearest CIA intelligence was based in Islamabad in Pakistan. And they somehow saw the Taliban in a very benign light. But these were not the Islamists of the traditional Islamists. These were people who disliked women. They oppressed women. They stopped schooling for girls and women. They carried out Islamic measures which nobody had ever done before, not even Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has always encouraged women's education, women to work. And the Taliban, they stopped television. They blew up people's television sets. They didn't believe in the media. They didn't believe in frankly, any kind of modern curricula at all. And eventually, I mean, people in the States were horrified that this was going on. But you had an administration at that point which wanted basically nothing to do with Afghanistan. They were fed up with the war. They didn't want to put more money into Afghanistan. They didn't want to develop Afghanistan. So as a result, we had a complete lack of American interest, and nor did the Americans mobilize other countries to help the Afghans develop a more modern society. So we had a real, if you like, a holocaust of despair. Very quickly, the favorable press reports that were coming out of Afghanistan became extremely negative. Now, one thing certainly the Americans did encourage was there was large quantities of gas and oil in Central Asia. And this was all dominated by the Soviet Union, or what was quickly going to become the breakup of the Soviet Union. But all the Central Asian countries had oil and gas. Most prominently was Turkmenistan, which was a neighbor of Afghanistan on its western flank, and had enormous quantities of gas, which it couldn't sell anywhere because it was landlocked, and the Americans had stopped, encouraging any kind of sales from the Soviet Union. And so when the Soviet Union broke up and these Central Asian states became independent, they all tried to cut deals with their various neighbors to sell their oil and gas. And the Turkmen said, to the Afghans and to the Americans, buy our gas and ship it to Pakistan and India by pipeline, where it's very badly needed. And the Americans liked this idea very much and supported an American company. There was a Bolivian company that they encouraged, but it was then given over to the Unicol, which was at that time one of the major American oil companies. But people like me were extremely critical because we said, look, first you have to make peace in Afghanistan. There's a civil war going on. How are you going to be able to build a pipeline, protect it, etc., in the middle of a civil war? And the Americans were very gung-ho, and they had no concept of the problems that Afghanistan would create for them. And so it really became wishful thinking that somehow you could develop a pipeline across Iran. The Americans were not speaking to Iran. Remember the hostage crisis and all the rest of it. And from Iran enter, from Turkmenistan enter through Iran and then through Afghanistan and placate the warlords. So they said, oh, the Americans said, we'll buy the warlords. So they went out and tried to buy the support of the warlords. But warlords are not are for sale only for brief moments. They're not strategically for sale, as it were. And the plan fell apart. It never really took off because once the Taliban had conquered Afghanistan, then the issue of terrorists came up because the Taliban were giving shelter to Osama bin Laden. They were giving shelter, who had just bombed American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. And then this whole conflict about whether the Americans could even dare to support a Taliban who had given shelter to not just Al-Qaeda, but also militant groups in China, in Central Asia, in India, through Pakistan. So it became a much more complicated puzzle for the Americans than it ever looked at initially.
All right, that's the first half of our conversation with Ahmed Rashid. Tune in next time for the second half. And tune in for the rest of the bonus episodes because we talk to some other amazing guests. We have Malalai Joya, a social activist and a former Afghan politician. We have a wonderful conversation with her. We have Cy Hirsch, Afghan chroniclers Elizabeth Gould and Paul Fitzgerald, and some other stuff on the fun side of things. With talk about movies and culture from the Afghan jihad era. So stay tuned. No flipping, as Larry Sanders used to say. And we'll see you next time. Bye.